everyone. Thank you for joining us for this year's Ahmad Tehrani Symposium. I'm Nicholas Tamancho. I'm the head of the Department of Architecture here at MIT. And before I say a few words about this evening's event, I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. MIT acknowledges Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation and Massachusetts people. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. I will begin with a thank you to my predecessor, former department head Nader Tehrani, for his generous and continued support of the department through this annual symposium. I have been fortunate enough to know Nader since a fateful internship after I'd run out of money backpacking in an office adjacent to his in the summer of 1996. I have to really thank him from this stage for his wisdom and guidance across all these intervening years, and especially since, as usual, I've entered into this role several steps behind him, but benefiting from everything he did before. I've been fortunate across this time to have had more than one conversation with Nader about the remarkable legacy and remarkable character of his father, Ahmad Tehrani. Though it was not my privilege to know him, his most remarkable legacy as a diplomat and human being seems to have been to bring people together, as he is, of course, bringing us together tonight. Such a spirit is at the heart of the Tehrani Symposium itself, which connects communities across architecture and design practices, from engineering to graphic design, structural design, photography, and beyond. That the most essential parts of even these thin walls that divide us are the doorways we walk through between them to embrace each other seems a particularly important spirit in which to enter this evening and at this particular moment in our own larger history. After our presentation tonight, we will take questions, both through the webcast and on the stage, and here in the room. But to introduce our guests tonight for the Tehrani Symposium, I'd like to introduce my valued colleague Yolande Daniels, Associate Professor of Architecture and Head of our Lectures Committee, who will introduce the guests. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us for Parallels and Intersections, a talk by Kim Yao, Stephen Cassell, and Jared Della Valle. I'll just introduce each one, and then they'll join us for the discussion. Stephen Cassell is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and principal of Architecture Research Office. He holds an undergraduate degree in architecture from Princeton University and received his Master's of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Stephen is a lecturer at MIT and an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University. He has served as the Schur Professor at the University of Virginia and as the Friedman Professor at the University of California at Berkeley. He has also taught at Harvard University, Princeton University, and the Rhode Island School of Design. Stephen is the former chair of the board of the Van Allen Institute in New York, member of the New York City Green Codes Task Force, and the leadership committee of the Lower Mississippi River Delta Design Initiative. Kim Yao is also a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and principal of Architecture Research Office. She holds an undergraduate degree in architecture from Columbia University and a master's in architecture from Princeton University. Kim is also currently a lecturer at MIT and has taught at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, the School of Constructed Environments at Parsons the New School of Design, and Barnard College. Kim has been awarded the AIA New York Medal of Honor and the Beverly Willis Foundation Mentorship Award. She is president of the AIA New York. She was president of the AIA New York in 2020 and serves on the board of the Center for Architecture. Both Kim and Stephen have lectured widely throughout the United States and abroad. Architecture Research Office is the New York City firm united by their collaborative process, commitment to accountable action, and social and environmental responsibility. Research gives their work purpose and intention, and they'll share that with us today. Jared Della Valle has been a real estate professional and architect for more than 20 years. And he has managed the acquisition and redevelopment of more than 2 million square feet in New York City, along the High Line, in the Hudson Yards, in Dumbo, and downtown Brooklyn. He holds a BA, a Bachelor of Architecture from Lehigh University, and a master's degree in both architecture and construction management from Washington University, St. Louis, Missouri. Jared is a vice chair of the Van Allen Institute. He sits on the board of the Architecture League of New York and the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, and he is a member of the U.S. Green Building Council. Jared has previously taught at Columbia University, Syracuse University, Washington University, Parsons School of Constructed Environments, and Lehigh University. Please join me in welcoming them tonight. We're very pleased to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introductions, and thanks for all being here. We're really excited to join you tonight and have this conversation. We've had a lot of fun preparing for it and thinking about what we wanted to talk about, and in the nature and the spirit of having a conversation, we wanted to share a little bit and then break and talk and maybe have some conversation and questions, hopefully from all of you or people who are listening and watching online. And then we're going to share a little bit more, like present a little bit more, and then break and talk. So we kind of wanted to mix it up. So I hope that you feel sort of engaged and animated, and we'll have some cool questions, and we could just have a conversation instead of just talking at you for like our whole time together tonight. So that's the goal. Did I leave anything out?
You got it.
Okay. So, and when we were invited to come and spend this time with you, we were brainstorming about who we wanted to, who we thought we would invite as a conversant in this conversation. And Jared was at the top of our list because he's been such a great collaborator and friend and colleague for many, many years. And so we thought it would be wonderful to kind of reflect on our firms and practices, on our collaboration, hence Jared's excellent title, Parallels and Intersections. And so that's what we wanted to talk with you about tonight. That collaboration and that experience sort of going out into the world and starting your firm and thinking about where you want to be spending your time is something that we've had this parallel journey over the past 30 years, and we're not going to take you through all of those steps, but that's a little bit of what we wanted to talk about tonight. And you can see that illustrated here kind of in the span of that time frame, highlights of different projects, but I think when Jared talks about Alloy's work, it'll sort of point out the differences between our models of practice and how we work and what our roles are like in our profession, but also where we have a lot of overlaps in terms of what we value and what matters to us in terms of the design process. So I'm going to start with just a really quick overview and intro to ARO. Thank you, Yolanda, for the nice introduction. Basically, we're a New York City-based practice. We just moved to Brooklyn, so that's new. And we're about 35 or 36 people. Stephen and I are partners also with Adam Urinsky, who also is going to be teaching here with us in the future. And we really believe in kind of having a flat office, super collaborative studio environment, everybody kind of in the same space, kind of working towards shared goals together. And we do that across a really broad range of types of projects. That kind of embracing diversity and the type of work we do is critically important to us and is really kind of foundational to our model. And also foundational to that model is just how we work. So we have this sort of methodology of investigation, inquiry, analysis, kind of understanding context, communities, the problem at hand of what we're trying to do in the work, and iterating and synthesizing that information. And so the process and methodology is really important to us. That builds up the kind of foundation for what our design work is like. Rooted in that is also engagement, making sure that we're connecting with stakeholders, broader communities, and doing that in all different formats so that we really understand the values that are at play within in any project that we are kind of conceiving and working on. Strategic thinking is a big component of that too, and so for us, being strategic in our choices in order to maximize design impact is critically important. We do that at the scale of individual spaces or buildings, at the scale of campuses and institutes and universities, and at the scale of cities. And so applying kind of that model of thinking and that process can happen at all these scales, which is also part of that idea of being really diverse in our work. And we, at the end of the day, just love making stuff. And so being kind of innovative in how we think about working with materials and applying those materials in creative ways is really a big part of our process, and we do that in close collaborations with many people. And so we're going to talk about collaboration a lot and later today, but whether it's doing a staircase with Guy Nordenson or creating an acoustic wall out of concrete with Threshold Acoustics, so we know that that concrete is, influential in terms of a space, or learning from the people who actually build and construct our projects like this Mason in Brooklyn. So that collaborative part of the process is really important to our work. Mentoring is also important, and so one of the critical ideas for us is that we believe that our most important design project is the design of the office, how we think about the office, how we create the space that we work in, and an environment for everybody to sort of be part of the process and invested in the process is critically important. So mentorship within the firm, kind of training the whole architect and transparency in that model is really critical. And then taking that and really taking that out into the world. And so at all levels in our office, from like interns to like the three of us, we also mentor outside of the firm in other contexts. And that's something kind of a value set that we think is really important, as well as just asking everybody in the firm to be engaged. Like, how do we contribute to our community? How do we stand up for the things that we care about? How do we sort of advocate for issues and policies that impact the built environment in New York City or in other places? All of those things are really important. And at the end of the day, making sure that we're having fun doing what we're doing, and that we're actually creating a culture in the office that is the environment that we want to spend our time in, but also a culture that creates the kind of work that we want to be doing. And so this is like us on our service days. We're actually leaving really early in the morning tomorrow for service day in Brooklyn, so that we can plant in Fort Greene Park. But in the rain, which is going to be great. But basically taking that time to really like nurture and cultivate the office environment that we want is a huge part of like where we spend our energy. Jared.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you to both Kim and Stephen for allowing me to participate in the conversation tonight. The first thing you'll notice on the slide is the sheer number of projects up against, say, a development company and an architecture firm. I'm going to try to unpack very quickly the kind of structure of our firm, and I hope people will ask questions. I'm incredibly candid. I also tend to swear a lot, but if there are questions that people want to understand about how it works or how the sausage is made, I would encourage you to kind of go there in the Q&A. Wrong way. So Alloy's really 5 companies. A lot of this is legal structuring, but first and foremost, we're a development company. We have a design company. We're licensed, and we're the architect of record and the design architect for all of our work. We're also real estate brokers. That's the advisory company. We have a construction company. Sometimes we execute our own work. And of course, now that we're starting to own the real estate that we make, we have a management company, and the goal of that is to set the culture. So we have a little bit of a control problem, which is that we like to control the process, the communication, the thinking, and sort of everything that goes into it. And we joke, it's sort of like whatever it takes. It was not intended to be a platypus, but it is kind of a platypus, which is kind of this really awkward thing, but it's also kind of wonderful and joyful at the same time. Despite being a for-profit company, what we like to say is we like to do good and do well. We're mission-based. Stephen and I had the privilege of both being board chair at Van Allen, and I think that work that we take with us sort of drove a mission at our company to a degree, which is, we're focused strictly on Brooklyn, and our mission is to make Brooklyn beautiful, sustainable, and equitable, right? And we get to make these value decisions about what our work is about. And we're architects and developers. We are always, as I said, the architects of our work, although we do tend to collaborate. And it's this sort of interesting diversity and complexity challenge, which is where we sort of succeed as a company. And we've made it up. Like, our practice is entirely made up. When I was your age, I went through the process of figuring out how to be a developer because I wanted agency of the conversation. And so our entire practice model is sort of a made-up process or a fictional process that has tended to succeed, but we're always questioning how architecture practice should work and how development practice should work. So the dilemma and the opportunity is that, of course, the development community needs the architect from the moment they think about the project, and even while they're fixing the project at the end and stabilizing it, right? But we were capturing very little of the value equation. So my own trajectory, literally, I wrote a thesis when I was in graduate school about being an architect, developer, contractor, and that's what I'm doing. I realized you could be the most talented person in the room, but somebody else was going to make the decision about how much to spend or whether they were going to choose to make that thing that you had envisioned, right, based on their program. So the real difference between developer and the architect was the developer was determining program and value proposition to a degree, right? I started a traditional practice. I started doing development, and over time, sort of morphed entirely into a development company. And fundamentally, what that means is that we take risk. We are an architecture practice really through and through. We call ourselves an architect-led development practice. Of the 20 people in our office, 16 are architects, 8 are licensed. It's a studio just like any other studio, but people do multiple things, right? They're Swiss Army knives. People are brokers and architects. People work in the construction field and they're architects. People are helping us acquire site and they're architects. Nobody comes with an understanding of underwriting or any of those other things. We know a lot more than we think, or the education tells us that we think. And so our practice is a series of projects over a long period of time, and people participate in that over a long period of time. So unlike a traditional architecture model, right, where you make money on time, we make money not only on time, but we make money because we're using half the number of people, doubling, in a lot of cases, how much effort we're putting on that project, but then we get to keep the real estate at the end, right? So there's a sort of different proposition. The corporate structure is really complicated, right? I mentioned the 5 firms. We literally sign agreements between ourselves, and we pay ourselves. Like, and my business partner writes the invoice and I sign the check. Right? There's literally this practice and circular practice where our lenders and our partners and everybody else sort of demands, in an awkward way, how the industry has established itself, but we've completely eviscerated sort of the traditional model of the architect. We do that, and you can see that evisceration on the right, which is I'm signing a change order as me as the owner, me as the architect, and me as the contractor, sort of completely taking away all of the checks and balances that are meant to be there. And candidly, we spend a lot of money on legal. This is a note from my business partner to me saying, holy shit, we're spending $120,000 a month on legal to do this. The important part about all of this is that we get to choose, right? Like, we built a piece of software, we track where we want to buy, and all we have to do to buy our next project is pay more than the next person, right? But that usually means it's a design problem that we can just solve better than our development peers can. So over the last 17 years, we've literally only done 10 projects. Right? So it's just a different practice.
So Jared showed how they have complete agency. I'm going to show you how we have no agency whatsoever and don't make any money. But what we wanted to do is sort of talk you through the life of our practice through projects. So I'm going to show you 30 years of projects in 6.5 minutes, theoretically at least. Yeah, very fast. And then Jared's going to do the same thing for a slightly short amount of time, which is not fair in the same amount of time. So early projects, our interests when we started the firm was really the craft of architecture and making space and elevating the everyday experience and sort of engagement of site. And then like a real focus on tectonics and materiality. This is the Corten shingles for that house that I just showed. It's in Colorado. And that focus on materiality extended to different types of projects, whether it's just fabric, light, and color, like this spa, an early project that we did. But at the same time, and as Kim mentioned, we always thought of architecture as strategic, and how can you be strategic within the frame of each project to have the most impact? So this 550 square foot Armed Forces recruiting station in the center of Times Square, we used like a simple motif, the American flag. It was actually very good to get our clients, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, to approve it, but we knew in 3 months to design and approve it. We knew that within the context of Times Square, that would have multiplicity of meanings and sort of gain power from where it is and different understandings. So how can you be strategic on how you approach each project to have the most impact? We started to move into doing academic projects, strategic interventions at Princeton School of Architecture, trying to see how can we do surgical interventions that impact the entire building and that change the life of the school in this case. A turning point is actually an interiors project we did at Brown University, maybe 10 years in, where we started to really focus our research on the pre-design process, on intense programmatic analysis of mission, analysis of the people who are there, and much deeper engagement of the different stakeholders for the project, and that leading into sort of the architectural strategies that we put forward. And this type of research expanded to theoretical projects. For Rising Currents, a show at Museum of Modern Art, and this was based on some research we did with Guy Nordenson, and then a collaboration with Susanna Drake of D-Land Studio, looking at the impact of climate change in the greater New York Harbor and resiliency, different strategies for resiliency. That continued post Superstorm Sandy, working with Department of City Planning and the Housing Resiliency Group in specific areas of the city. And so our sort of research, sort of the bounds of research expanded from materiality to program to sort of larger fields. At the same time, we started to engage different types of clients, and I'm going to talk about diversity of work. We started a long 10-year relationship with the furniture company Knoll, both with their corporate headquarters and their showrooms across the country. Knoll has an incredible history. It's basically you're designing with designers, and actually a lot of our projects were with or for designers of different types, and trying to engage context, in this case, the history of the company and the history of design within the company, and then how that morphed from city to city and how that changed. And there was a sort of fortuitous part of this project is we started to work with their factories on designing architectural products themselves, working with Spinneybeck and Filzfelt, because they had these amazing CNC machines, knife cutting machines, and that to develop architectural products that we actually is the Aero collection. You can go out and buy it today if you want. That we continue to expand on over the last 10 or 12 years. And this is really dealing with issues of acoustics. We're working with Threshold Acoustics again and acousticians on this. Parallel to this was, and around midway through our practice, we started to engage more cultural work. This is the restoration of Donald Judd's house in Soho. This really, the research was engaging almost a posthumous, what we'd say, a collaboration with Donald Judd, sort of understanding how his conception of art and habitation and space, and then also sort of the deep restoration of an 1865 cast iron building. And really our goal here in this case was to leave no fingerprints. We actually took the whole building apart, rebuild a modern infrastructure and put it back together again, but it should look like we were never there. That's not always the case on all projects. Some projects we were there, rare projects that we get flaming pots for the opening of the project in a giant bear claw. This is a Nippert Stadium, University of Cincinnati, addition to that stadium. And by now you should realize that a fundamental tenet from day one of our office is to get sort of radical diversity of project types within the office, whether it's a stadium or a chicken coop. It doesn't matter what we do. What we really believe in is those change in scales and types really start to force us to think differently about each project, and ideas cross-pollinate from one to another. And that goes on to a project we did for Congregation Bet Shemat Torah, which is the world's largest LGBTQ synagogue, working with and interviewing over 100 congregants, also religious scholars and the clergy here, to understand how can we design space that one supports their really strong social justice mission, but also supports their idea of reinterpreting Judaism in light of human sexuality and how to be, in their words, to be radically traditional. So we started to really focus on projects that had a larger social impact at this point in our project. And of course, always doing projects in the public realm, large and small, whether it's a boathouse in Brooklyn Bridge Park, or educational projects. And we started to engage in educational projects at different age groups, and working hard and sort of expanding how we engage the clients and really engaging educators to make sure the spaces we're designing really aligned with the pedagogy of each school and each teacher that we're designing for, to really support the students within that environment. Another turning point in sort of expanding into cultural work is a restoration of Mark Rothko, the Rothko Chapel in Houston. Again, like the Judd, trying to make it look like we weren't there. But really, this was part of a larger project to support their mission of social justice and expansion into a campus. And while we had always done this to a certain point, we started and continue to do is really set up a series of project principles that we develop with the stakeholders and the different people we interview that guide the conceptual development of the project all the way through design and through construction, as every decision that's made sort of moving back and checking on this. So in this case, expanding it into a larger campus that's going on today. We also have been trying to expand the collaborations that we do, all of our projects and collaborations in different ways, whether it's with the artist Sterling Ruby and the fashion designer Rolf Simmons for Calvin Klein, or with the Dia Art Foundation, one of multiple projects that we're doing with Dia, and really working with them to align and understand their conception of art within found architectural space, but a heavily curated found architectural space, and really also how to think about adaptive reuse, which being when we were a young practice in New York is always a core of your practice, how to sort of push that forward in new and meaningful ways. And so to finish up, we're always continuing to expand the tectonics in our office. This is a research project that we did with Boston Valley Terracotta, Tri-Pyramid Fabrication, and also Heinz's facade engineers, looking at a tension net terracotta sort of prototype. This is a theoretical project for a tension net terracotta brise soleil, or a project that we just finished in Tacoma, Washington, that's for commuter school or basically University of Washington's Tacoma campus. That is a commuter school that's both mass timber and dealing with the issues of course, embodied carbon, but also, just as importantly, deeply engaging the community, trying to create a school that supports the community and make sure people stay within Tacoma. So that's my 6 or 7 minutes now. Jared gets to do his parallels.
I'll do that. In so many ways, the overlap of the start of my practice, which started as a traditional architecture firm with my partner Andy Bernheimer, and this is, imagine you're in 2004 right now, was wanting to get work like ARO's work, right? And to a degree born out of a frustration for not being able to diversify our practice in a way. And at the time we're doing wonderful projects. So this is a house that we built in 2004, actually for my now business partner, Catherine McCombie, who's the chair of our company. And she was living in a building I was converting for another developer, and she interviewed me to convert that apartment for her. And she decided not to move ahead, but she instead hired us to design this beautiful house. And it was a wonderful moment of us, really the start of Alloy in a weird way. And at that same time, I'm also working on some really interesting projects. Paul Rudolph's home, which was sort of discovered, but the client didn't know actually who Paul Rudolph was, and we sort of secretly restored this house. And reinterpreted a lot of the contemporary details from Mylar to actual like polished stainless steel and all of the other wonderful things that you could do today that he couldn't afford. But he was actually a developer in a weird way. He developed this and actually built it with student labor, which wasn't really wonderful, but it's something that he did. So I think in a lot of ways we share this idea about how we focus on detail and resolution, and I was getting frustrated and wanting to start to exercise at scale because we were stuck at sort of designing houses and smaller projects. And so I started to, in some ways, remember my thesis and tried to leverage my practice into getting larger work. And so I started looking at zoning in new neighborhoods. And so along the High Line in around 2005, I started really investigating the zoning and seeking opportunities before the High Line or Chelsea, Special West Chelsea District became West Chelsea, and the High Line was there. And so started to uncover drafts of the zoning resolution, started to look for opportunities, found opportunities, and then ended up offering to invest all of my services to developers who would then take that on. And interestingly enough, the developer who was I had previously collaborated with for Catherine's apartment that she considered ended up taking on the role of developer here, where I was the architect and I contributed my fees to get to build, at that time, a 60,000 square foot building. We invested a couple $100,000 into becoming the architect and getting to be our first building, which was still in the High Line, was quite wonderful. But at that same time, Catherine and I started to get to know each other better, and she's like, well, I'm not moving into that space. I'd love to invest with you. I know you're interested in real estate. If you see something amazing, go there. And we'll work together. And so I found this one parcel that was really short. You can see it's only a 50-foot deep lot on one side. And addressing these issues of zoning and complexity, found real opportunity and value in solving a zoning problem with a real estate, with the lens of an architect about how to solve a zoning resolution problem, and getting to exercise our muscles in wanting to do this. But at the same time, made a deal with Catherine, who literally wired me $1 million on a handshake and said, I'll buy the penthouse in advance, and I would do all of the architectural services, and we started essentially a business together where she would go ahead and buy the penthouse, and I would get to build this building, and I contributed all of my time and services to that, essentially, and deferred all of that, right? And that was my investment. I didn't have any money at the time, so we were starting our practice in that way, or starting Alloy in that way. And we end up with these really wonderful spaces, right? And surprising spaces sometimes where we're trying to start marrying tectonics of the building at the same time with experience, where we get these massive windows and flex our muscles on some of my construction experience and the desire from a construction company to build this in a really special way. So some of those facade panels are 50 feet wide. Some of the windows are like 15 feet wide. And a lot of times we have this kind of, I'll do that, but never again. Like that was okay to try, and that was a risk we took, but I would never do that. As we started to get interested in the zoning resolution, and Catherine and I met AJ at that time, where we formally started Alloy, we also started to really focus on these other new neighborhoods. And at the time, Hudson Yards was a new neighborhood and unzoned. And the property owner from 459 West 18th Street introduced us to his friend who was selling a property in Hudson Yards. And of course, knowing what the density would yield, which is these super high density sites, FARs of 24, we went ahead and we acquired a site before the market collapse happened, and we started ourselves to realize, well, maybe we can do bigger work. This was actually an early collaboration with ARO, where we acquired the site. We started to develop plans for a building, and in lieu of growing our practice, it was one of these moments where we chose to collaborate together, actually. At the same time, we're sort of growing the practice. We're starting to bring in all these consultants that we never knew we needed, like lobbyists and crisis PR teams and other things. And understanding the overlap of politics and real estate became a real thing, right? The zoning resolution, New York City politics, how that would work. And we started to leverage that into bigger opportunities. So the project we just saw a minute ago, which was the first collaboration with ARO, became the second collaboration with ARO because we made a deal with the city to acquire an adjacent parcel, turn what was 500,000 square feet into over 1 million square feet. Again, really use the zoning resolution as a way to participate and create, call it new value in a neighborhood that didn't yet exist. This is like 2007, 2008, before all the rest of the Hudson Yards was there. And literally, Alloy, which was a 6-person firm, was competed against the related companies because the head of the real estate board of New York called me up. Was like, I heard you have a 1 million square foot site. I want you to compete for Coach, which is the first building to be built in the Hudson Yards. So it was literally like Davy and Goliath. You know, it was like really funny kind of competition that literally pitted us up against related companies. So that time was really interesting, right? We're talking about 2008, 2009. Follow that with a kind of market collapse and a moment of austerity, right? Where we as developers are starting to acquire more, create bigger opportunities. Well, we decided to sell our Hudson Yards site because we couldn't control the outcome. We needed Boston Properties as our partner. They were the 800-pound gorilla. We couldn't determine our own destiny. And so we're like, we're going to get out of there. And it was at that moment we really transitioned to moving to Brooklyn. And we bought this old building that actually we had lost in a previous bidding war over 50 grand. That developer went under during the financial crisis. And we had this beautiful gutted building, essentially. And so we literally were like, we can just sell this raw space. We had $300,000. We called in a children's book illustrator, Oliver Jeffers. And we asked, and this was sort of the birthplace of our brokerage company, is there a different way to consider selling real estate? We let Oliver go with a white can of paint and $10,000. And he said, I'm selling space to families, so big lofts to live in, like the dumbest thing. He painted floor plans on the floor. And in one night, we sold $20 million of real estate, realizing that in Brooklyn, we had stumbled upon what people were looking for, right? Could we come up with a way to make an architecture that could both respect the history of the place, deliver space to families who wanted design, but where it wasn't being, they weren't being marketed to in that way, right? Brooklyn was just an alternative for space or other things or value. But not necessarily what I like to call the want economy. So as that started to happen and we realized there was such huge success, some of the adjacent neighbors, and this was across the street, and you'll see a series of projects there across the street from us, we acquired another warehouse building. This one was 45 feet wide, but it went 200 feet deep. And we realized in order for it to succeed, we literally had to hollow out the middle of the building and rip it in half. And so this kind of idea of what's new and what's old. The images are sort of the same space. I actually live at the bottom of the image on the right. And there's this idea of sort of just cutting through the middle of the building and how to sell even larger spaces. And then we take the floor area for what was in the middle of the building and reposition it on the top. And this is in a landmark district. And so these are some of the first visible additions in a landmark district. And again, you're talking about Brooklyn neighborhoods, typical or traditional Brooklyn neighborhoods that are landmarked, like Brooklyn Heights, where you could never see anything, right? And so having these conversations with landmarks about what this neighborhood was about and what the surprises were. At the same time, this brokerage thing is sort of really coming to us, and just being our own idiots and having no editing board, we decided we'd work with Oliver again. That was obviously successful. He rode off in his little scooter and he came back with the image on the left, and we're like, oh my God, really? Do you really want us to do this? And so we ultimately toned it down. But we had a similar experience in the sales process where delivering these like really clear, raw messages that were not about luxury, which were not about something else, but we're kind of tapping into like just honesty and sincerity in all regards relative to both the architecture and the communication became really valuable. So our next projects, also a block from our office, it was kind of inevitable that we would head back to construction and become a construction company in some ways, because I came and I had this dual master's in construction, and these were some of the first passive houses that were built, and we'll show one of the first ones in the United States, which is certainly the first ones in Brooklyn, where we had this really tight site adjacent to the Brooklyn Bridge. It had this incredible noise constraint to it. And we ended up building these passive house buildings really to control noise, but ultimately had this sort of outcome of also being able to deliver these incredibly sustainable buildings. And then how do we connect this new architecture in a historic neighborhood to the history of this place, right? So you can see the building in the back, which is actually my office building, the concrete one, way in the back, which is one of the first uses of concrete as both skin and structure. And we ended up developing this ductile facade system, which essentially became a shield to address the acoustic issues, which had to be hung off the buildings really carefully, but which enabled us to isolate the sound and create this really amazing thermal layer between us and the outside. And it's sort of surprising, right, to use a new technology. These are townhouses, right, the goal of which was to deliver buildings that were actually smaller than what could be built, but that we would sell every square foot. So as we start getting into and past construction company and brokerage and other things, these other opportunities start coming up. So this is in Brooklyn Bridge Park. This is 1 John Street. This is probably one of our most visible projects. Intimacy of place, and why our mission has Brooklyn in it, is getting to know a place really well, right? So this is, again, across the street from our office and a place that we walk every day, and Brooklyn Bridge Park wasn't built at the time. And we recognize this really weird phenomenon, this location adjacent to the bridges, which is that the view is better down low. And actually, in a place that's so hard, the idea that the park was really a privilege and we were going to be building a building in the park, that was sacrosanct, right? So we had to respect that. And so playing a game with this very clear diagram of how a gradient of windows could be really legible on the exterior, could play a game with the historic context of the adjacent buildings, where we start inverting the plane of the windows, where bricks literally change size of the facade, right? Something that only an architect would do as a developer. But and how that becomes really legible on the interior and what that means as an experience, right? So the bottom floor apartments actually absorbed in the marketplace literally twice as fast. So we got to raise prices 10 or 12 times before we got to sell the apartments on the left, which are the penthouses, where by the time we sold the penthouses at the top, they were so valuable to a degree, but they also had this real clear constraint. You can see what the window view looks like. It doesn't mean that they can't see Manhattan, but they experience something completely different, right? And so the building becomes this acoustical shield for things. So this brokerage story and the communication process about how to make place, and the alloy kind of does everything. In the process of building 1 John Street, we started to really focus on this idea of public-private partnerships. And so during the period of design, we built a park inside our site, and we allowed that in order to create a place, and we call that the John Street pasture. And so we built this park while they were building the park around us inside our site before they built the park, and then ultimately got people to know this place as John Street, ultimately for 1 John Street. But then we had to figure out how to take down the park, and so we brought in a bunch of goats, and I had to find a shepherd to sleep with the goats overnight in the park to eat the flowers that we put in the park for a little while. That didn't work out so well because some of the goats broke free. But not everything does work out. And I'm kind of bringing you full circle with these set of images. As I was transitioning from architect to developer with my partner, I sort of jokingly made the comment, it's going to be faster for me to donate a museum if I become a developer than it will be that we will get hired as a commission as architects to design it. And ultimately, the images you're seeing here is a space that we donated in the bottom of 1 John Street, which is early childhood arts museum space for the Brooklyn Children's Museum, that we donated in order to celebrate sort of the park being a place of inclusivity, rather than taking over that space with luxury condominiums, to develop a space that we could give away that acknowledged the, call it, historic context of artists moving to that place and gentrifying and then getting pushed out by families to a degree, of how do we make early childhood arts-based space in that place and invite people in throughout the year. That's it.
Cool.
And now we talk.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we wanted to break, so we're going to break and hopefully have some questions and things. But I was going to start. We've been prepping, for a little while and having these conversations, sort of reflective conversations amongst ourselves. But it's so fun to listen to this now because new things are coming to mind. And I love what you were saying, Jared, about the Swiss Army knife of, the Swiss Army knife for all the people in the office who have to be able to do 10 different things, and it's maximizing the potential of every person. And I feel like in our practice, we also, people will often say, well, are you, does somebody, are you specialists or do you generalize? And we really are definitely generalists in our approach, and what everybody in the office has to be able to kind of do everything, and nobody specializes by typology or, specific skill sets. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the kind of that ethos, does that still work? And as you're doing, is there a pressure point where it starts to transition and you feel like people need to be more specialized in what they're doing?
No,
because we talk about that.
I feel like in architecture school, you don't learn to make buildings, you learn to solve problems, right? And so we try to use our practice to just have a conversation, and we want to get our hands dirty and participate in the problem, but we also realize there's a real limit to our expertise. And so I think your practice, we bring in the best consultants that we can to help us answer the questions and to have a lot more complexity, but then to do research and figure out actually you're saying that, but what does that actually mean? Can we really, I know that's how people usually do it, but why do you do it that way? Right? And I think both of our firms do that a lot, which is that inquiry layer of, yes, I hear what you're saying, but why do you do it that way, right? To try to understand the why behind it. So it enables us to do all of these things that we're not expert in, but to bring in experts and participation. Like when we do brokerage, we're often collaborating with another company. We don't like to collaborate at all on development, candidly, right? Just, we need to set the value set. We need to solve the problem. We need to find investors who want to invest in that thing. But design is a dialogue. And so whether that's collaborating with a firm like yours, which we love to do, or bringing in an expert where we're just going to learn something entirely new. I think the same is true for you, I guess. I don't know how you think about that, but
yeah, no, I think that's very true. And when Stephen was talking about, or was showing like the sort of overview of some of our work, and actually I love how you talked about like expanding the firm through those collaborations. But we always like to acknowledge that we like know less about many things than many other people, and so you want to kind of partner with the people who are going to teach you, and you're going to learn from them. And that's a big part of how we think about collaborating. And it's also the place where we are able to push forward like research agendas within the office, or things that we want to test, or sort of tectonic innovation, or like new ideas that we haven't done before. We choose the collaborators so that we can both like have fun and learn from the process, but actually like push our work forward as part of that process. So I think it's really important kind of ethos.
Yeah, and we're some ways really, really similar, and in some ways really, really different. Like we're just like painfully methodical. and you'll come in and goes like, why don't you turn it upside down?
Yeah.
Which you did 2
Yeah.
days ago for a project. But within that, like I think actually really similar set of shared values in terms of what our goals are for having our practice, and what our goals are doing what we do within the world, and what we care about.
Yeah, look, I think we're both both companies are dumb enough and confident enough to say, what is the right question here? You know what I mean? Like learning how to ask the right question has been kind of foundational. And also like the diversity of the work, I couldn't achieve the diversity of work that ARO is achieving, right? Like it's a really wonderful practice model, and it's really rare actually to have institutional work, private work, folly type things where you're working on a chicken coop or something else, right? Like we have to buy them, but we also buy them intentionally with that like intent, saying, I'd like to do that. That's a problem I'd like to solve, right? And the editing part of the work that you guys are choosing to do from a practice perspective is super interesting. And I think there's also a lot of overlap there, right? Like knowing when to say no, right? Like for what types of projects we work on has been, I think, a skill that we've both exercised in that regard. We'll
often ask Jared out for advice. We'll be like, okay, let's go out and we're gonna have drinks or have dinner, and then we'll ask him for advice about like things that we're thinking about. And I remember once we were doing this, and you were like, well, you just don't have to do that. Like you don't have to grow, or you don't have to you could, why don't you just stop? Why don't you just, focus on X or Y? So it's been, that's a big part of kind of the friendship and kind of mutual respect, is also being able to go to your colleagues and your peers and just ask for that advice, and get, have a sounding board with someone to kind of come from the outside and share. But
to Stephen's point, we also we have no checks and balances, right?
Yeah.
So we were not even presenting to ourselves. We'll walk over to someone's desk and be like, why don't you try that? And then we try this, and it's sort of we weren't even taking these pauses to say, let's present this information to ourselves and see logically where it goes. So a lot of times we're inviting them to our studio to literally force a review of our own work and have somebody give us a critique. We're students, because we're going to learn from the conversation, and the deliberate nature means that they get to ask us the really hard questions about why did you do that? And oftentimes it seems so obvious to us, we're unpacking some real estate problem, and there's a financial benefit over here, and there's a subsidy, and then there's somebody else where we can really express our value set through something, and they're like, oh, but what if you just did this, right? And the obviousness of it sometimes in the kind of tactical pause or the approach that they have about their own work, about like reflecting and doing the work and presenting and then like thinking about it and engaging in those conversations is like part of our office hygiene in a way that we're trying to learn from them in our own work, because again, we go kind of unchecked.
And of course, while you're describing the different financial transfers and land transfers, all I hear is the Charlie Brown teacher talk. Walk, 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 walk. That really is like certain ways. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, me neither.
Are there, does anybody have any questions right now? Like, we could just have a talk for a little bit, like, rather than continue talking. Katie! Oh, and please, use a mic because of the webcast, if you don't
And
mind.
then we have more after this.
We're going to do a
Just
little more
remind you.
slideshow, and then we'll do more talking.
It's on.
Is it?
No, it's not. Mm-mm.
Okay. Well, you are 3 partners. I don't know how many, Jared, you have in your how
3.
you work as a team. 3. So maybe coming off of what you've just spoken about, how do you go about decision making? And are there people who like raise red flags, or like how do you go through discussing what you end up working on?
For Alloy, my partners and I have an 8:30 a.m. call every day, and we've had that for 17 years. And so we're the investment committee, as it were, but the practice is a studio culture. Like, the youngest person in the office sometimes has the most sway because they have the most naive and most wonderful response to the problem. And so we try to make space for real architectural conversations. And the partners, we've been through a lot together, when you're investing. Like right now, I think I have like $450 million of contingent liabilities at the moment, of like responsibility to like pay people back stuff that we borrowed. And so you rely on each other to kind of trust your instinct and like have these gut checks. And so a lot of times we talk, it's literally just personal, like, how are you feeling about this decision? And how do you make this sort of investment decisions? Catherine doesn't really engage so much in design. AJ and I are, both trained as architects, and Catherine is not. But the kind of value set around the work and the why are we making the investment, or what is the opportunity cost of doing another project when we just don't need to, or should we push ourselves, and what does that effort mean? What does it mean to our studio culture, right? I think we care a lot about the same things that they do. And once a quarter, the youngest person in our office has to organize an office outing, and we do surfing and all those other things, right? And like the privilege that Catherine has really given us is that perspective to say no, which is we don't have to do work. And if we don't, we take our money and we invest it so that we can cover our overhead for the future. We're kind of not relying on clients, right? So we try to take the money from the real estate and like pack it away for later. That's part of our succession plan and other things. But basically, decision making is, everybody has a voice at the table, but the 3 partners literally meet every day, and we're really close.
Do you want to answer for us?
Yeah. Well,
Oh, I was going to say one thing is that Stephen said, what did you use the word, that we're very methodical? Like, I always say that decisions in our office happen at like a glacial pace. Like, literally we'll talk about something, and I'm not exaggerating, and we like talk about it and talk about it more, and then we'll be, we should talk to someone, we should talk to Jared about this, and then we like, it can take us like 6 months to like make like a structural change in the office. And that's just it, and part of that is because the conversation's happening between the 3 of us, but it's also happening like with the people in the firm who are our firm leaders, who are directors in the office, and we have that conversation and try to work towards consensus, and then sometimes we interject. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's right. By the way, we also have 8:30 meetings that we copied from Alloy. We started that at the start of COVID.
I suggested we maybe didn't have to have them every day.
I know.
But I got outvoted on that.
Yes, they do.
So
Exactly. So that's how we make decisions. It's 2 to 1. Because Adam and I don't have small children or children. We don't have small kids.
They're not that small, but anyway.
And decisions are happen in different levels. Whether to take project decisions or not. We learned early on to say no to a lot of things. We have a very clear division of responsibilities. If a possible project comes in, Adam says no immediately. Kim says yes. A lot of the time. And I'm like, I'm not sure.
Oh my God.
And then on projects, when Kim became partner, we sort of shifted the model. We used to have like Adam and I sat next to each other and we would credit each other, but we had Adam projects and Stephen projects, and we didn't want to have a balkanization within the office or have that more so. And
Like where you're fighting over, not fighting, but like, oh, these are my people, this is my studio, this is not like
Thank you
our
for the
studio.
description.
Right, like, yeah, that's, okay. Yeah.
And we decided to always have two partners on every project, like a partner in charge and a collaborating principal. And it's a really great model. Like, we work together for a really long time. We have complete trust in each other. We sometimes agree, we sometimes disagree, but that dialogue also is modeling dialogue that we want to happen with everyone within the firm, not just between us. So hopefully decisions are happening at a much larger scale, not just within leadership, but within, or design decisions within discussions with the full project team, or just pulling someone over and it's like, hey, could you look at this? And it's someone who hasn't been working on it.
Well, neither firm is eponymous, right? And I think they both speak to the culture about like the place that we want our team to like participate in, right? And I think that's a not subtle gesture, actually, about process and practice and like culture of inclusivity relative to design decisions. And we each have our own reasons at the time. And I started in that way. And I just, I never want it to be about me, right? I want to help nudge from a value set perspective, or use my instinct after, the number of years of, faking it to get to where we are, to try to say, oh, that's a bad idea, or we've been through that before, maybe we should reconsider how we do that. But I think culturally, both offices really function in a very similar way relative to how our team participates with the principals.
Did that answer your question? Are there any other questions? Yeah? Oh, Mike, thank you.
This is for Jared. I know when you mentioned you were developing, you mentioned zoning issues and zoning laws. Do you see yourself as a developer and I guess architect as zoning laws as more of a challenge to work within, or because I know you mentioned also working with lobbyists, or as something themselves to be changed, and you as someone who can influence or change zoning laws?
Yeah, zoning's all about opportunity in my mind. I mean, first of all, in New York City, zoning defines value, just full stop. Unlike Boston, like there's no, I guess, other than in landmark districts, there's no discretion around it. There's a law, there's a code, like you can build to that. What defines property values is that you can build definitively, and a lender can't question that, how much space that you're saying you can build. So there's a lot of value in that. We tend to do better as a company finding the really complicated shit, like where the lot's triangular, the zoning doesn't necessarily make sense, or it's underzoned or miszoned. And now we have this practice of just changing the zoning, like where we tell Department of City Planning, this is wrong contextually, and you should do something different. And that process is called ULURP. And the ULURP process is really complicated and political, which is why we now have 3 lobbyists and a crisis PR team and all that other stuff, because you have to go through a very public process to change the outcome. And so one of the projects you'll see soon was kind of born out of that. But it's trying to understand our city, right, and see it through the lens of an architect. And in the early days, we used zoning to find the new neighborhoods, right, and anticipate what city planning was anticipating in order to find value. And usually the more complicated, the worse the site was, the more environmental contamination it had, the better as architects we could solve that problem, because every developer was never going to spend the money to solve the problem. They either had a solution and they would bid on it, or they wouldn't. And if they didn't, the property would sit there for longer, and the longer it sat, the more time we had to solve the problem, right? And as architects wanting to solve the problem and doing design competitions and all those other things, we would just invest in ourselves. And if we really invested in ourselves and were really spending time on it and really getting close, like I had worked on 459 West 18th Street for like a year before I made a deal with Catherine. just trying to solve the zoning stuff. And what's so interesting is that the zoning resolution now uses a photograph of that building for what an R8A/a dormer building looks like. And it was like, we solved that problem, and the city is saying, you solved it perfectly. Like, this is how you do it now, right? And so it's trying to leverage that, being able to see that. So we see it as opportunity. Like, that's where value is created, just full stop.
I think there was one other question back up there, and then we'll keep going.
I want to ask about engagement for both of the practice. For Stefan and Kim, you've talked a lot about you engage public in meaningful ways. How does engagement inform the design? Does it actually inform the design? And why do you invest to do the engagement in your work? And for Jared, it seems to me that you engage completely, not different, but let's say more open groups of agents in this longer process of development and design. I wonder, how does that engagement inform your work as well? And also, you've talked about investing in Brooklyn specifically, like living there as a resident is, I don't know if you live there, but really living through the time in that space, in the neighborhood. Like, why do you choose to do that instead of expanding your market outside of your neighborhood?
Where do you want to start?
We can start with let's start with engagement. We'll start with engagement. Is that all right? We do it because it does inform the work. And so when Stephen was showing that kind of earlier kind of higher ed project we did at Brown, like one of our first Princeton, Brown, those earlier projects, we would do really extensive user engagement, like stakeholder engagement, like interviews, talking to, like if someone were doing a project here, talking to students, talking to staff, talking to faculty, understanding like the people who are really part of the community. And then obviously if you're doing public work, you want that to be as expansive as possible and to start to engage like community, like writ large, people in the public, and to actually intersect with as many voices as possible so that you know that what you're aspiring to in the work is really aligned with not just, the owner's goals, but actually like what you're trying to give voice to the community through the design work that you're doing by listening and trying to incorporate values or ideas or aspirations or goals into the work through what we create. So I don't know if you want to talk about launch a little bit. That's a good example to talk about community and engagement.
There's community engagement. I'm going to answer a different part of that first, because I think, we're not designing the building for ourselves. Yeah, you are, but out for the community maybe. But the goal is, the goal is to get clients whose mission we care about, right? And if we're doing that, then our goal, we sort of like to say we're their advocates through design. It's like we're their advocates. We're trying to put it out in the world within the teacher who's going to be teaching there and teaching kids. And we want to do that in the best possible way so that it lives on long beyond us and really supports that mission, that style of teaching, et cetera. So nothing makes us happier. That school that I showed with the kid opening the door, running in, one of the teachers stopped us. We were up for a punch list after it opened, and just said, I feel like I've been teaching here for years. It just feels like I've always been here in a real, she meant that in a good way, not a existential crisis. And so that, that's what gives us satisfaction as designers, is to put that in a world where it has impact and it has meaning, and whether that's directly for the clients or the community that you're designing for. Both are equally important. And so we have to talk to people. I'm not a teacher, right? I'm not a teacher at that school, at that place, or I can't think about how what we're doing impacts, and we are iterative in our design. So we're always going back to these people and showing them where we are and getting feedback and adjusting and doing that again. So that, the ultimate goal is to put something out in the world that has more, that is meaningful for us because it has meaning and impact for the people that we design for.
Yeah, and part of that comes also from the fact that you don't, just because you've done a school or a classroom or like a library in like one place, doesn't mean that that's the right solution in a totally different place, right, or a totally different community. So the whole point is really to like tie and embed the work in the place where it's being created, aligned around that kind of that mission or those values or again those aspirations. And so we all build, we're talking about experience, like we're talking about 30 years of experience through the firms. But you take those lessons learned and apply them in new places, but every place is totally different. Leadership is different, community members are different. So you want to be reflecting that, we try to reflect that in the work. Do you want to talk about Brooklyn? I want
to respond to a joke Stephen made. We don't design buildings for ourselves, right? Like, but it started that way. Like, it started that way, right? Like, when people ask me what I do, I say we make buildings, because I can't answer the question. If I say I'm a developer, people are like, you're an asshole. If I say I'm an architect, people don't think that I'm really like taking risk or doing these other things. If I tell them I'm a broker, I'm even worse. And like if I say I'm a contractor, like it doesn't work. So I just say I make buildings. And the truth of the matter is, I love making buildings, right? Like, we're making buildings in our city. I'm not the receiver of those things. All of my partners live in our buildings that we've made, right? And the making of the buildings and having them all be a block within our office, there was 10 years of my life where my office is across the street from where I live, and I walk to every job site several times a week and walk through those job sites. Like, participating in the making of architecture is wonderful, and you get to experience things, and it makes you a better architect, because you're literally, all of the decisions that you fussed over, whether the ductile concrete should be a ½ inch at the tip or whether it should have a little reveal, and how it ultimately got executed, and understanding how things you make a lot of decisions based on either your own experience or your recollection, or how the tradespeople are like literally touching the stuff that they're using to make it. And so that process and that intimacy of that, as my business partners say, we don't make fucking cupcakes, right? Like, you can't throw them out. Like, you're making a building, it's supposed to last 100 years, right? And so that process of participating in it, getting to know the neighborhood and where we live, right? Understanding what would make that a better place, how to implant like our work in our collective experience and our memories, like how we remember places and how we experience that and how other people will experience the homes that we make for them. Which we fuss like over the craziest stuff. On CA, on our project, sometimes I have 17 architects doing CA. Like, another architecture firm would have like 3 people doing that, right? And it won't take us 4 years. We'll build that project 9 months ahead of schedule. I'll defer on the engagement part, because we'll answer the why engagement through one of the projects we're going to share. That's a collaboration that we're doing that I think will make it more evident about like, why do we engage other people in the process? But hopefully that answers your question.
And so on that note, let's go to the next intersections. Jared, you get to lead.
All right. So quickly, call it beginning of architect developer post-graduation. When I had my own firm and I started in 96 or whatever, I won a design competition, and I became increasingly frustrated after winning that design competition and getting a commission for the GSA with like how I'd get other work. And so I was like, I did this graduate school thesis and I wanted to push into it. And so it took me literally 7 years to get my first development deal after making the decision to do that, because I never took a real estate class. I took one business school class, right? How to write a business plan. And I just had to convince people and teach myself. I taught myself Excel. There was no school for real estate at the time. I wasn't going to go back to get my MBA. And so I was literally marketing my work and trying to figure it out. So ultimately, my first development deal in New York City was convincing New York City, who ran an RFP for affordable housing, that architects could be developers. And we responded to an RFP that was designed for builders as architects as developers. And we partnered with Architecture Research Office, Lewis Cermaki Lewis, and Briggs Knowles Studio, and we treated it like a design competition instead. And so we designed some prototypes for an RFP that the city of New York held called New Foundations, where they were trying to dispose of former tax-paying sites that had gone vacant. And so we proposed architects as developers, and we ended up acquiring essentially 10 properties for $1,000 in East New York. And it was our first development, and the idea being for affordable housing, because it was in an affordable housing neighborhood, is that everything should be identifiable and individual, right? My home looks like this, right? And could we develop as a team a set of prototypes, and there were 2 different prototypes, and a shared set of materials that we could then go ahead and build affordable housing, and that we could celebrate someone's most important purchase in their life. Literally, we built these 10 houses. We had 10,000 applications for the 10 houses. And it's not because they were amazing, it's because there's just such extraordinary demand, right, for affordable housing. And there's a housing crisis. And this was in 2002, right, not after 180,000 new people entered Brooklyn as a place. So, pass that on.
Yes. So what you can see then, you're seeing these buildings designed by all of the firms that Jared mentioned, and kind of just, I love the conversation around working the problem, because that's like what we do all the time, but using a set kind of material palette, really maximizing the potential of each of those sites through those typical plans, and kind of rethinking the typology of these connected homes, connected homes. So here you can kind of see, oops, wrong way, how some of these materialized, and that they do kind of have their own identity, each in its own right, in this one little part of the neighborhood. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but you can see the palette is like the corrugated metal, and like hardy panels, like was it? Yeah, and wood siding, pretty simple and straightforward.
We had to break every rule of affordable housing for HPD to do that. And I think we built it for $108 a foot at the time.
Yeah. I would never remember that, but Jared does.
So in a similar vein, this idea, and we're collaborating through these things. There was another design competition, and this was a small project in Syracuse, and there was sort of no need for us to collaborate, right? But there was both a development challenge and a design problem. And in this particular neighborhood in Syracuse, the real estate problem is that it cost $150,000 to build a new house. They had all these underperforming tax lots, but the value of the house was only like $70,000 or $80,000, right? And so it's an inverted value equation. And so the development proposition is, how do you solve that problem over the long term and build new housing when the market doesn't really support it, right? And there's a need for housing. It's not like the housing is underutilized. The houses are all full. And part of the way of doing that is looking to a degree at like Brooklyn and New York City or the surrounding boroughs, where 2-family houses, 3-family houses, or how a house might change over time, where you could bring in revenue from an apartment, or have a 3-bedroom apartment, or just different typologies within the same building envelope, and how that building envelope might be able to accommodate a whole slew of different programs in a really compact envelope, became this idea of thinking about sustainability in a different way, right? Economic sustainability. You shouldn't need $70,000 of state subsidy in order to create new housing, right? So there has to be another form of subsidy, and so the way to subsidize that is actually through income and rent, right? And so we tried to tackle the problem of building not single-family houses, but we turned it into a multifamily project in order to solve the problem of making housing in Syracuse.
So that first plan is really showing them this idea that it's a prototype that could have happened at all of these sites within that neighborhood. Then it's like, this is also working the problem, like just kind of thinking through the form and massing of the building, which we did collaboratively between the 2 firms, like old school modeling, and trying to maximize the potential of that form within the kind of confines of that constrained plan and that constrained site. So how can you kind of tweak the form to create the home? We also, as part of the process, decided like, hey, well, this is again this idea of like, let's do something different, let's do something new that we wanted to engage head on. And we said, well, our house is going to be a passive house. We're going to design a passive house principles. It was passive house certified. We had never done this before. This is our first kind of time doing it. And do that as part of the kind of economic viability also of the home. So how do you make the home affordable also in the long term for the people who are going to be living there through energy efficiency? And so that really dictated, of course, like the wall assemblies and everything, but just orientation, where glazing is on the building, how much glazing there was, so that the building could perform up to those passive house principles.
Yeah, I think this was like the 2nd or 3rd passive house in the United States. It was
Yeah,
like
it was very
impossible to
early.
get approved.
Yeah, and like cool.
It was also, this was in the middle of the global economic meltdown. So we had so many people between the two offices working
on this?
tiny 1,100 square foot project.
Yeah.
Because we had nothing else to do.
Yeah. All right, and now the latest and greatest.
The contemporary collaboration that we're working on, and we've been working on together for about 5 years now, or more actually, is the Alloy block in downtown Brooklyn, which is actually a full city block that we acquired. It's 5 buildings. And it includes a whole host of uses, right? Everything residential, office, cultural, retail, et cetera. And, for context, obviously, this is not surprising, but Brooklyn's the nation's 4th largest city, and it's growing pretty quickly. It's about to take over Chicago as the 3rd largest city. And there's a density problem. We have this amazing site that we acquired that is across from Atlantic Terminal, which is the 2nd largest transportation hub in our city, but really it means the 2nd largest transportation hub almost in the nation in terms of total ridership for the year. Part of this block had these historic buildings on it, and our goal for part of that was preservation. And ultimately, when I get into the story about how all of this happened, we were going to create 2 public schools in the middle of the block, which we collaborate with ARO on, where ARO takes the lead on. We collaborate through the master plan. And the project has to be built in these 2 phases. And right now we're in construction on the first half, which is a little over 500,000 square feet of total construction. In the mixed-use tower, there's 440 apartments, and includes a mix of 45 affordable units and 440 total apartments. And then there's 2 new schools, which includes a dual language high school, the only one in New York City for the Arabic Community Khalil Gibran Institute. So the development challenges and the context around the site is really interesting on the sort of brownstone Brooklyn side of that image. There's literally townhouses across the street that were built in the late 1800s, and on Flatbush Avenue on the downtown Brooklyn side, that's the sort of, call it, extension of Canal Street and the original cow path, but that turned into the, call it, location of density in downtown Brooklyn. Atlantic Terminal and Barclays is across the street. So Alloy acquired this, call it, triangular piece, and the remaining parcel on the left was owned by the Department of Education, and we approached them about acquiring their air rights after we had acquired the adjacent parcels. And we were introduced to a state agency called the Education Construction Fund. And we said, look, we'd like to acquire your air rights. They said, that's great and all, but we don't really want to do that. We really need new schools. We're going to introduce you to ECF. And ECF is a state agency that develops schools on behalf of the School Construction Authority and DOE. And they do that in locations where they can leverage the existing city-owned site in neighborhoods that require new schools, but that also can accommodate a significant amount of density. They ran an RFEI. We owned the rest of the block, so we succeeded because there was really nobody else who could participate or compete against us, right? Because the air rights and how air rights move or how development works in New York City is that we were really the only likely candidate for that site. And we went through this ULURP process in 2018. We had never done any of that. On the block, we have this Khalil Gibran School, which is amazing, but the original structures were built in the 1860s, 1890s. It was added over to a really tiny school. It's wonderful to have an Arabic school, but the school actually really suffered because it wasn't accessible. They had no gymnasium, they had no auditorium, they had no playground. When they need to convene the population, the principal literally needed to say the same thing 4 times because he had to convene groups of people that could accommodate in a classroom size. And so this is when we started to collaborate with ARO. We went through this public process. We literally took all of the traditional public process, real estate concerns, and we tried to invert them. And everybody says developers are opaque. We're like, okay, we're going to be really transparent. People are saying they don't engage the public. We're like, we're going to engage the public more than anybody's ever engaged the public. And we had 140 public meetings, literally with anybody who wanted to meet with us. And we changed the basic density on the block from an FAR of 6.5 to 15.75 in the most transportation-rich location in the city. So we took all of that feedback we got from people. People were terrified of height. People didn't want parking. People didn't want loading docks. They had, we have the Williamsburg Savings Bank across the street, which is a beloved skyscraper, sort of the only skyscraper in downtown Brooklyn since the 20s in New York. And we modified our master plan based on all of that community engagement. And were we not the architect and the developer at the same time, we never could have solved the problem in a way. We were literally designing live with people, provided people could accept this concept of density, which was a really difficult thing to do, right? Is to say, look, we're going to have a fundamental disagreement on height, but we have all these public things that we can achieve. How are we going to achieve it? So being architect and developer, we worked on this master plan with ARO, and we started from this place that we ended in a place that we never could have imagined. We literally saved historic structures, like you can see in the bottom of the slide. We were landing buildings on top of buildings, right, with commercial office space. We have skyscrapers that start at the 9th floor. The school in the mid-block is a high school on Flatbush Avenue, is a lower school on State Street. And then we're taking this literally Flatiron proportion shaped site, and we're putting really valuable residential in that location, right? So we're tackling, they call it geometric constraints of the problem, and tucking in, and we gave ARO the most impossible problem. And most of the reason we collaborated with them is to have them push back on us, right? To say, I need more space for this. That's not right for us. And so we let them essentially develop the schools in the middle of the block and be the owner. Said, this is your project. We're building the residences next to you. You're going to tell us what you need, and we're going to tell you what we need, and together we're going to kind of hash it out, right? And there's no way. I mean, we started acquiring this block in 2015, but you can see here we're preserving the historic structures. The lower school is on this. There's a small courtyard. Street walls are mirroring, the townhouses across the street and sort of setting back. It could have been tabula rasa, right? We owned the whole block. We could have just started over. And so this proposition of what you can yield to the process of how do you get to the question, what are we hearing from our constituency, right? To your question about engagement, and how do we tackle that together as a series of problems was really where it was at.
And so we basically had the school. It is incredibly, this is really a project about negotiation and negotiating an incredibly complex site or irregular site for two schools, a primary school and the Khalil Gibran International Academy, the high school. Actually, I'm going to go back here. So basically, Flatbush Avenue is here. The school you can see in the middle right there. The high school we wanted to serve just simply as a civic object on Flatbush Avenue. That Flatbush Avenue slopes there, so when you're coming down, you see the building as that object, and sort of allowed high school students can stand up to Flatbush Avenue or vice versa, and then put the primary school on the quieter Brownstone Street in smaller scale, though it all connects together. And then really with Alloy, who worked with us, I say it's negotiation. It's negotiation of the site and the program, but it's also negotiation working with the school construction authority. They are, I think, the largest
landowner, largest contractor in New York City.
Right, they're enormous. They have a 800-page design manual. With Alloy's help to really sort of push them, let's make this a passive house school. Let's make this a prototype for you to build sustainable schools within the city. And what does that mean? It aligns with local law that's requiring lower EUI within that. But it is a lot of this is really working with the school construction authority to get them comfortable with this idea of how do you make incredibly tight envelope building systems, all of that, and just over a long process, getting to a place where they're comfortable, which to be valid, they own millions of square feet and oversee, they need buildings they can take care of. And to their credit, they say every building you design for them should last 100 years. And if you see the school it's replacing, which is 150 years old, that's probably an understatement of how long it's going to be used for. So basically, we're mid-block. This is Flatbush Avenue right here. The high school entrance is sort of below the cube. They are part of it sets back to create a terrace for the high school students off of the dining halls. You can see a section here. Basically, the yellow is high school, green is shared space, and then the blue is the primary school. And so basically the scale of the school intersects with the Brownstone Brooklyn on the left-hand side, the high school on the right-hand side. There's some retail at the base that's part of Jared's purview. And really trying to both work with them and work with a very different envelope. Normally passive house, this is going to be the largest educational passive house project in the United States. Work with very different construction conditions to make a tight building envelope. So it was an incredibly technical project of how do you make that work within union construction in New York City, next to non-union construction. And it's going on right now. This is the State Street side, and the primary school entrance. There's a courtyard between the historic building on the left to get into it, and then the play space on the roof. We focused on just simply detailed brick construction and just trying to make something that is well detailed and will last a long time within the fabric of the city. And this is a construction shot from probably a month ago. I now, since our office is in Brooklyn, walk by this every day. And it's been incredibly challenging, but incredibly rewarding as well. And rewarding on that collaboration, because a lot of this was a tag team process of both giving each other crits, but also trying to move the client to a place that we thought they should end up being now for the rest.
Yeah, I mean, we own 2/3 of the block, and so we never would have been able to convince SCA to do a passive house school if we literally had to like tell them we're not doing the whole project unless it's passive house.
And so the energy use will be 1/3 of a typical New York City school in terms of energy EUI per square foot.
Yeah, it's challenging, right? To Stephen's point, their maintenance and operations team is the largest maintenance and operations team of the city, right? So trying to get them to do things and leveraging our private development to achieve a value set. We made a promise to make the most sustainable block in Brooklyn when we went through the public process. So, 49 State Street is the first passive house school. 505 State Street is the first all-electric skyscraper. And so this Flatiron-shaped site needs to both negotiate the kind of triangular geometry of the block and respond to the Williamsburg Savings Bank, but it also had an extreme, at the time, 4 years ago, right? We're talking about electrification now, but at the beginning, this was sort of a political fight that was happening with our governor and National Grid over whether they were going to even be able to deliver us gas service. So we're like, why are we going to do gas? And at the time, there were no electric boilers that could support a building of this scale. And so like engineering through that and trying to figure out how to actually achieve electrification where it just wouldn't be a complete energy hog, and like focusing on a completely bulletproof building envelope, right? It's like one of the first triple glazed building envelopes. None of this stuff seems esoteric now, but 4 or 5 years ago, it was like, you're doing what? Like, why are you doing electric boilers? Why would you do these things? But this kind of push toward carbon neutrality, right, became important. And for us, it was our first really, big building that we're designing. I've never designed a skyscraper before. And the sort of same intention and care and how we would go through designing a curtain wall up against, that's called ARO work of detailing and window operation or some of these things, and how they start to appear in the skyline, right? But the real trick here is what we did, which is we used design to create density in a different place. We literally tripled the density on the block. We created $230 million of public benefit, right? We built a school, $150 million school. We're building 200 units of affordable housing, New York City's first electric skyscraper, New York City's first passive house schools, New York City's first LEED community on the block. And we did that with no public subsidy, right? So we leveraged design to create density, which created an economic engine, which allowed us to express our values set through our work and to get to this new place. And so like the collaboration moments, right, with ARO's office, in keeping us in check and like what we can and can't achieve. How do we promise to do these things? How do they help us through the design process in a lot of ways, right? We leveraged their office to not grow. We gave them something that they could love more than we could, right? The schools, the institutional part, where we had to focus on like, we actually had to get the economic engine right. How do we deliver, apartments in this location that spoke to a different value set? And how do we think through all of that and ultimately end up in a master plan with like really grand ambitions about what the potential of our collective work is?
So that concludes the presentation piece. I think we wanted to have more conversation. If there are other questions, we could obviously have some conversation here, and I don't know how much time we have in the room, so I wanted to open it up first. Any?
I
Does that mean no more questions?
No more questions.
I think we're all really candid, so if people have questions, it's a unique time, right? You're in school, everybody's like imagining what their future professional life is going to be like and starting your firms. And I think for both of us, designing the firm was the design problem, right? Like, I think there's a big part of that, and thinking through, like, what is the culture of this place? How do I express my value set through my work? What type of work do I want to do? I think it's the place we both, I think, most proudly succeeded, through our work. So in that regard, I would encourage inquiry, as it were.
Calvin, do you have a question? I could. Ask.
Well, one of the things I would encourage you to do, and I like to say this rant all the time, is don't do any work for free for anybody. Like, full stop. Well, yes, invest in yourself, right? Like, the beginning part of being a practitioner where people would, quote, give you the opportunity to give your most valuable ideas to them for free in exchange for the possibility of getting work is gross. Just like, full stop. Invest in yourself. You want to do a design competition? Awesome. If someone wants to pay you for your work, great. If not, spend the time on something you love. You will learn from it. And whether that's designing a practice or basket weaving or, knitting or going on travel, like, don't give away the most valuable part. Your instincts, who you are, your ideas, your, personal reflections on place. That's where the value is, right? As you get older, you get better at trusting your own instinct about design. So, like, just don't give that away.
Okay, I was just thinking of something, and to get time for Calvin to form his question. I'm curious, like, in your practice, and thank you for sharing the timeline for both. I'm curious for you, yourself and your practice, which is the most important project and why?
Everyone's going to have a different answer, I'm sorry.
Well, I'll take the easy one, which is the office is the most important project, right? There you go. So the whole kit and caboodle. I had to think about the architecture one.
It's always the project I'm working on, of course, because you're so invested and focused in it. Some projects have had more payback in terms of just satisfaction and seeing the impact that it's had. The synagogue that we designed, just the lives that it impacted in terms of the LGBT community or Jewish community was really meaningful, and creating a home for them. So that's always a project that's close in my heart.
For me, it's pretty easy. I think 1 John Street was a real transition for me from having a chip on my shoulder about, like, why is the architect getting so screwed in the value equation of life here? Like, we take a lot of risk. We don't get remunerated appropriately. Like, my brother's a surgeon, he's making 30 times what I was making for almost less risk. And it's like, this doesn't make any sense, right? So a lot of the early days were literally about, like, value proposition, like pure economic, like, can I do this? I don't need to be taught how to be a developer. I know how to make buildings. I'm just going to do this. To, like, a fundamental shift of, like, wow, I can do things with the potential of being a client that I could never do as an architect. I get to establish the principles and priorities in the value equation where the word value can suddenly mean something entirely different, right? And that was a moment of realization that was really provocative for me. And it's at the same time, we're doing that, participating on boards for the first time and really thinking about mission and alignment, that the business starts to really shift, I think, to mission-based business that shows, like, we need to drag the real estate industry behind us now, right? Like, our job is to be provocateur now and say, don't tell me you can't do it. We can, and we need to make a difference. And so that's by far, like, that was the pivotal moment in my practice about what our potential was.
I have a question. Thank you. I'm interested in these projects that you work on are super big, especially the school that you just showed. It's big. It takes a really long period of time and seems like a lot of red tape and like New York City, administration, whatnots that you're dealing with. And how do you not let that bog you down? And how do you sort of stay excited and not get discouraged by sort of like years of difficulty in those types of situations?
Sometimes when I give talks, I talk about like slowness, that like what we do as a profession is like, it's like, I loved your quote about cupcakes. It's not making cupcakes. It's like, it's really, 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 really hard work. And that's also why you want to be doing the work with people you want to spend time with, that you find and clients who you believe in, because you're going to be together for a long time. It's like a very long and arduous relationship to go through the process. So the diversity is one way. Like for us, like if you have lots of different kinds of things going on, I mean, they have different time scales and different kind of cycles of satisfaction that can come up, because a lot of projects, go through certain phases and they stop for a long time, and then they go and they stop, especially like nonprofits and certain institutional projects where they're fundraising or doing advancement in order to fund the project. So it's that kind of ability to have multiple things happening, like in art for us, is one way that helps, significantly. Or continuing to make sure that you're creating those opportunities for, we like to say we want to always be learning, like how you can, which hopefully you saw a little bit today, like how you can keep pushing our own knowledge set and work through things. That's another place where you're sort of investing your energy. That's a nice diversion from the bureaucracy and the frustration. I love it. It's born out of frustration, but I think that's another place that like you can sort of engage, that helps offset like some of the aspects of the process that are hard.
Yeah, it also helps to have partners to complain to silently. What's good for the 8:30 meeting, but it's also we always know that we just keep, if someone says no or make a change or throw something in the way, we're just quietly, relentlessly just do it again. And we know if we keep doing that, you end up with something really good that's going to be there for a long time, and just be patient and pushing through that. And so, complaining to your partners and then just like knowing, okay, I can do it again, or try it 3 other ways, and just keep moving it forward, because I feel incredibly fortunate that I love what I do. And I still make sure, part of the design of the office and picking projects to make sure we're happy and we're satisfied in what we're working on. That's sort of fundamental part of it.
I had a teacher in school who said there are 2 types of architects. There are soldiers and there are casualties of war. And I determined early on I was going to kind of soldier on, and like the endurance and the head banging, like, we acquired Flatbush or the LA block in 2015, right? We were working on that for 8 years. There were 12 different versions of that project. First of all, we didn't know we were going to end up acquiring 5 pieces versus the 2 we started with. Like we had the craziest negotiations, the most awkward, outcomes. There are lots of moments where it's like, this is going to blow up and this is going to become something else, right? And so it's like producing a movie, right? Being a developer, I equate a little bit to like producing a movie, which is I don't know what the end is going to be like yet. Like nobody's handing us a thing and saying just go. And what we like about that now is like being city makers, right? We just acquired something, closing on it in a few weeks. It's like, that is 7 to 8 years worth of work. And I know what I'm going to be doing for the next 7 to 8 years. And it's a place I know, and it's a place I ride by on my bicycle 3 or 4 days a week. And like, it's really fun to like think about that. And it's, everybody's always like, it's like watching grass grow. Like you never show up one day and it's like all of a sudden there's a building there. Right? Like every day is incrementally like you're achieving a little bit more. And so I happen to find that really rewarding, and especially for our company where we're at risk, like that focus has been really good. For a long time, I said my hobby is my work. I'm realizing now that's a bad idea, like, because I wasn't taking a break from work and I didn't have space for myself, and especially on the, you know, call it PTSD side of all of the things that we all experience through our life and all the stresses of things. Like, I actually found, certainly as I get older and my kids get older, that I needed like other things to do. And so, you know, I like working on cars, so I'll take a car apart or I'll do something and just try to find ways to escape. Or I like working on my own house, or I designed a house for myself because I miss designing something small like that, right? Or designing a garage for myself or something else, right? Like I find other ways to like mitigate some of the monotony or some of the stress of some of those things. But you kind of have to have the endurance to go through it, you know? It's how architecture works. It's slow.
Maybe one last question? No?
Oh, we're fine.
Okay,
If
sorry.
you guys are
have
fine.
questions, we don't want to overstay our
Yeah, we are
welcome.
totally
But
fine.
I don't know if it's the last question.
Okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
I'm going to structure it as like a two-parter in the two directions. Jared, when you were talking about the platypus, like all of the things that are underneath or inside of Alloy, I think you identified that one of those is that you're beginning to manage properties as well.
Yeah.
I think we have an understanding maybe of the benefits of the design architect developer, but I'm curious what management as another thing that the designer does or the architect anticipates, how that changes your design process. And then Stephen and Kim, maybe the flip side of this, Stephen, you were just saying that you have this kind of investment in slow, diligent, meticulous work and how it enables things that will be there for a long time. And I'm wondering kind of pragmatically or in the business sense how you make the space for that if it's not something like that time isn't necessarily valued. And we're not trying to work for free, but how do you kind of open up or create the space to do that work?
I mean, the management side is super interesting, especially today with technology and our process. Like, you know, like most companies, we're working with the most advanced things that we can relative to visualization, digital twins, and technology, just about like how we actually document making a building. And because, you know, we get paid as architect and because we get paid as developer, we can afford to spend a lot more time in the like documentation of what the thing is. That's part of like the beauty of the construction process. And then as an outcome, like how do we actually manage, maintain that thing? But more critically for us, we've shifted our model from doing largely for sale architecture to things that we're going to own. And we're shifting into rentals. And from our perspective, operating in a city, we want to manage culture, right? Like, we're going to have people who are formerly homeless living in the same building that people are paying $100 a square foot in rent for, right? And how do we use architecture to democratize experience? How do people get greeted when they come in the door? Our work, we don't use the word luxury as an example. We make space for people. And they have to make their own judgment about the design choices we make, but we don't use marble, we use raw concrete, right? Like, we're using sincerity in a lot of the choices that we're making to like make visible the process of making. And so, like, it's our job to try to manage culture and manage experience in that way. And we think that there's a lot to do on that side, which is how do you make somebody who's formerly homeless feel great about coming home? And how do you make somebody who's making literally our tenants, the average tenant for us makes 70 times their rent in income. So a couple might be making $500,000 a year and renting a 2-bedroom apartment for like 10 grand a month. That's the same two people are going to get in the elevator, and the same two people have to feel great about coming home, right? And how do you manage that experience through culture? What are you messaging about sustainability? We, for example, think that carbon neutrality or care about the environment or equity, like we have an equity plan, which we push through everything, right? We create a lot of local hiring and all those other things. Like, how do we address that through our work? And it's one of the ways that we can do that. And we think the management company is kind of the future of like, what does it mean to be in an Alloy building and how do you feel there?
Do you want to go through that?
Sure. just to answer your second part, we're methodical. Sometimes we're very quickly methodical. Like, of course, not all. We don't get to dictate
Not
schedule.
always spatial.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Kim showed sort of our methodology. We have such a consistent methodology of how we look at things, not what the answer is. That happens on projects that we have 3 months to design, or 7 years of working through it, and so we just make space for that. And the way we also tag team within the office to sort of push things forward quickly if we need to.
Hello. Test.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, thank you very much for this talk. It kind of made me uncomfortable in a way, but a good way, because I come from a very design-oriented background. I went to SciArc, and for the first time I'm hearing stuff like, development, management, all these different terms. I thought that's kind of interesting. My question is geared more towards Alloy, and I'm actually interested in adaptive reuse. That's basically what my thesis was, and I'm kind of fascinated by that and all that kind of typologies and realms that adaptive reuse engages with. And I see this lineage of looking at the Brooklyn units, the Brooklyn adaptive reuse projects, and then all the way up to the city block design. I'm thinking, it's still adaptive reuse, but you're really working at like multiple scales, different scales. I guess my question is, what's that singular kind of line or the thing that ties the miniature scale versus that kind of mega scale in terms of adaptive reuse?
Look, New York City has a long history, and Brooklyn has a long history, and people experience those places in through their memories of what places are like. And so oftentimes and we've had an extraordinary amount of latitude working with landmarks, actually. And preservation at the Alloy block was elective, which I think people were surprised by. And so, it's different. It's just a different way to work. Unfortunately, there's been so much removal over the years. It doesn't mean I'm, focused on history or saying that we have to preserve all these neighborhoods, but so much of the large, big architecture is gone. The giant Con Edison plants and all of those other things which are being removed, and turbine halls and other things like that are just gone from our city. Penn Station, right, or some of the other things that have happened historically through that. There's not a lot of it, and it just so happens the places that we operate, there's a degree of diversity within that typology. Where Dumbo, where my office is and where I live, that historic district is defined by a 50-year span. And so there's a lot of diversity in that work, which makes it really appealing to work in, because each problem is a different design problem. And I don't know, I think we just really like it and we appreciate it, and we think it's how people appreciate the city. And so reinterpreting it sometimes is also wonderful, and there's a lot of other good models looking at that, like London or other places where they do a particularly good job at some of that, but maybe New York not so much.
How should we? Yeah.
So I think that's going to be the last question. So sorry, up there you can come up afterwards and ask us. We're here. Thank you so much for having us. It's really, really great to talk to you and hear your questions and talk to each other.
Yeah. Thank you.